So, in our message today, we talked about the idea last week that we're going to view the scriptures and this idea of belonging through the lens of adoption. And I promised you last week this would not be a guilt trip of everyone needs to adopt, you should, or support people who adopt, you should, and all that stuff, because James, the brother of Jesus, tells us in chapter 1 that the purest form of our religion is to care for orphans and widows in their distress. But we want to view the lens of Scripture because we looked last week at Jesus as being the adopted one, that his earthly father, Joseph, was not his biological father. And so in a sense, he was a stepfather of sorts. In a sense, we look at it through the lens of adoption to see that Jesus was adopted into a different family, which opens up the possibility for you and I, of all sorts of people, to be adopted into a new family. And we said that there's always room for one more. Of course, Susan and Ken and Andrea all got a good laugh at that last week because our houses are getting full in there. There's always room for one more. And so when you adopt a child, you get lots of questions. We get lots of questions about Malachi and Caleb. We get lots of questions about the process with international adoption. I am guessing those of you that have adopted domestically, you get asked a lot of questions about the process and about all the things that happen and we could go through a list of like the top 10 most frequently asked questions for adoptive children. But we do get asked a lot about what to are. How much does it cost? That's probably for us in international, that's probably one of the biggest ones that we get. But there are all sorts of other ones as well. And one of them that we get asked sometimes, and I've heard other adoptive families get asked this as well that have multiple children, is, are they really siblings? So like Malachi and Caleb one day down the road may get asked, are they really, I know you adopted them, but are they really siblings? And now in the adoption world, it doesn't really matter because they're adopted. They're siblings now. But we get asked that question. And I think there's a real challenge, though, on the surface of asking that question. And as we think about belonging is, how does a child, an adoptive child, learn to become part of the family? Because at adoption, especially like international, I know those that foster to adopt, there's a long process. It takes a long time. A lot of times, when we went to China, we were there for 4 days. We were there sightseeing for 4 days, kind of turning our clocks around the China time. And then Monday morning comes, the first Monday we're there, day 5, and we go to a social welfare building, and they call our name. A nursery worker comes out, and there is Hongxi, Sun Hongxi, and he walks out, and they give him to you, and surprise, he's your baby. You get him, you take him home to your hotel, and you have about 24 hours to say whether you really want to adopt him or not, which we're looking forward to do that, and he's yours. There's no change, and it's really a traumatic experience, which would be a whole nother conversation. But the question would be is how does he become family? What's the process? Because he's in our heart, he's family, and he gets all the rights and benefits of being part of our family, but also Caleb and Malachi and any adopted child has to learn to become part of your family. So I want to show you a quick video, and we're going to watch it, and I'm going to have you watch it without any context first, other than knowing that I've been in Guatemala for a week. Malachi has been in our house for 6 months about at this time. So that's the only context I am going to give you. You gotta turn the volume. And I'm coming home at like 9 in the morning. Why are there 10 locks on the door?
Daddy!
Hey.
I missed you! Donuts!
Hi,
You missed
buddy.
that.
Now, so that was me coming home from Guatemala. You see that Chloe has a love of donuts, which she gets from her father, and she gets it honestly from her dad, because I get that excited for donuts too. And there was a lot of time that we weren't sure who she was more excited to see, me or the box of Dunkin' Donuts that was there. Andrea and I had that video for maybe 2 or 3 years, 2 years probably, where that video was about Chloe. It was about Chloe and just how hilarious it was that she was excited about me, but then she got completely distracted by the donuts that I brought home that day. until we watched it about 2 years later. And here's the context with it, is that 6 months into our adoption of Malachi, we thought he was doing really well. And this isn't to say that he wasn't. In January of that year, which had been about 3 months before this video was taken, Malachi had a very definitive line that he crossed where he began to look at Andrea especially, but also me, a little bit differently than caretakers. When you first adopt, especially internationally, the child tends to look at you as a caretaker because they've been in an orphanage for their entire life rather than a mom or dad. And even though they would call Andrea mama or maybe even me baba or dad, we were really just a source of food. That's really all we were with that. And so it's a progression. And with Malachi, it took about 2 years to really see him go to where he was. But what became evident after about 2 years, and we've gone back through and looked at pictures where we thought Malachi was doing really well, and we see them in such a different way now because we look and see that where we thought he was doing good, now we look at him like he looks shell-shocked and scared in those pictures. He looks unsettled in those pictures. And I want you to watch the video one more time. And keep an eye, I know we got to go through the locks again, but it seems like a bad sitcom, like Monty Python or something going through all the locks. But take a look at Malachi when he sees me. Don't let Chloe's adorable cuteness distract you.
Daddy!
Hey.
I missed you. Donuts!
Hi, buddy.
Now, we thought Malachi was doing really well, and he was, in the grand process of everything. But what became evident to us after about 2 years is he never looked at me when I walked in the door. And it became really hard to watch that video because we realized it became more real of the process of learning to become family for him. And there's a whole theory, Chris can probably talk about it with his degree, it's called an attachment theory of how we attach on to our parents and the people around us, and how kids that are adopted have to learn to attach on to new parents after they've been ripped away from their parents and other things like that. But it became really interesting for us to watch that video and to see the difference in Malachi and see how he had to learn to become family. Now, if you see Malachi right now, he will, and I would walk through the door after being away for a week in Guatemala, and actually when we got back from 2 weeks in China, he jumped up into my arms, he wrapped his arms around, and he does what we call a monkey hug, where he wraps both arms around our neck, and he takes his feet and wraps them around our waist, and he squeezes as tight as he possibly can. And there's a process there of learning to become family. And what I want to posit today and have you consider today, that in our Christian life that we have to learn to become family. We have to learn to become the sons and daughters of God. We have to learn to accept that we are adopted into a new family, which means leaving the old family behind. And it's really tough to do that. One of the questions that we get asked, especially in international adoption, is... and really you can kind of see it coming from a mile away, is how could your child's birth parents ever walk away from this child? And I've got to admit, I've asked the question myself, especially probably prior to meeting Malachi or Caleb. How could they do that? And for me personally, like in looking at this for the first time, and thinking about these questions, to think about like how could they do that? How cruel, how heartless, how cold could it be? But as adoptive parents, you select the narrative in a lot of ways, and it may be the possibility of considering is that birth parent or birth parents maybe did the most compassionate thing they knew how to do. That it was gut-wrenching, and it was maybe an act of love that perhaps they were in so much distress. Perhaps that there was no way that child was going to be able to get the medical attention or care that they possibly needed. And so we think about that all the time. I look into our boys' eyes, I see the image of our Creator in them, I see their smile and feel their love and the warmth, and it's like the warmth of 1,000 suns when Malachi wraps his arms and legs around you. I watch them play with other kids and see their kindness and compassion. I see the joy that they bring us, and I do. And when I hear Malachi say, Daddy, I'm left to maybe wonder, like, how could this child end up in our family? But I've also come to the point, I know Andrea has too, that when we see our kids, that we stop and pray for their birth parents. And we have a lot of love and compassion for them as well. Because I don't know the pain, I don't know that I could ever understand the pain that they must have felt to leave their children, and this is any adoptive child, to leave them, to walk away. There's a video this week that came out of India of a father giving up his child and leaving him at the doorsteps of a police station. And you saw the father lingering and giving his child a kiss, and even the security cameras caught him as he walked away, continuing to look back at this child. I think about how the birth parents must think about their sons every day, wondering whatever became of them. I think about the grief that they must carry with them. I think and wonder about how terrible their own circumstances must have been to believe that they were going to somehow give their boys a better chance at life by giving them up. And I think of the compassion and love their parents must have had to relinquish their boys for a better life. And relinquishing these two boys may have been the most loving thing that their birth parents could have ever done. The scriptures tell us a story of a people who were enslaved under the threat of genocide by Pharaoh, by their leader. And this Pharaoh, this leader, had decreed that because the Hebrew people had gotten so great, that all the boys, newborn boys, should be killed. Now, like any great movement, there was a resistance there, and we had midwives who refused to kill baby boys when they were born, who told Pharaoh that, oh, well, Hebrew women are much stronger than you Egyptian women, and they just have babies on their own, and they're already ready and good to go. And the story of a woman named Jochebed, who became pregnant, and where normally this might have been a source of joy for her and her family because of this decree, became a source of fear and pain and sorrow, because they knew it would be only a matter of time before the birth of this boy would be known to the Egyptian officials, and they would have to give that child up, and that child would die. The scriptures tell us in Exodus that Jochebed raised that child as long as she could until he was too big to go unnoticed by others. And so Jochebed did the only compassionate thing that she could think of doing in that time. She made and the Hebrew word literally is ark. It's the same word for Noah's ark. She made an ark, a basket, out of reeds. She waterproofed it with tar and pitch. And she took that baby boy that did not have a name yet, placed him in the basket, took him down to the river with his older sister, who later we find out is Miriam, maybe sang one last song or lullaby and gave a kiss, and pushed that child out into the river, praying that God would protect the child. She let go. She relinquished that child, praying for a better life than what they would have on their own. Jochebed relinquished, let go of this child that held so much promise for her, and releasing the child was a loving act as she prayed that God might protect her son. And as we think of birth parents and adoptions, like this was not abandonment. This was not some act of not paying attention. This was an intentional act, a compassionate act to try and do what was best for her son beyond her own context and capacity as a Hebrew mother under occupation. It was a farewell that was wrought in the furnace of a fierce mother love for her child. And I think for us, it gives us a look at and a glimpse at this idea of being able to relinquish or let go as an act that is part of the adoption act by a birth parent, but it is part of our spiritual act as well as we learn to become part of God's family. Let's think about God in a moment here, and we talked a little bit about this last week, that we could consider God the Father relinquishing Jesus the Son by sending him here on earth. Can you imagine that if you were divine and perfect and holy and all of these things, and all of a sudden you were going to relinquish yourself in human form, in Jesus, to a 13-year-old girl and her fiance? That's pretty scary. I can imagine giving a baby to my daughter Abby and be like, here you go, you're on your own for the next couple weeks. let's hope you do well, And here is God as the relinquishing one, relinquishing Jesus the Son. And at this point, God, in a way, becomes an onlooker to the Christ child in the arms of Mary and his adoptive father, Joseph. Can you imagine, like, when you see other people touch your kids, especially when they're little, you're, like, cringing inside, like, don't do that. Don't touch them, don't give them that food. And God in heaven is just like, keep them away from the donkey, Joseph, I know you're a carpenter, but watch out with the saw. He's not quite, I know he's divine and still human, but watch out. All of these things, God becomes an onlooker. And consider Jesus. Our theology holds that Jesus is the second person of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Our scriptures and our theology states that Jesus always existed with God. He was not born. He was not created. He was always present with God. And we assert that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. Fully God and fully human. It's a mystery. It's a paradox. Like, it's hard to explain that Jesus is God in flesh, John puts it. That's the best way I think we could possibly see this. Fully God, fully human. And yet we have this theology where Jesus also relinquished part of his divinity or his power, his rights to God. And Paul writes about this. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, he starts out, or actually not verse 5, but a little later. He says, though he was God, this is Jesus, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. And here's the relinquishing part. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born in human form. And when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. The theological term for this is this big word called kenosis. Not Kenobi. We're not Obi-Wan, but kenosis. And this kenosis means an emptying of yourself. That Jesus emptied himself of his rights as God. He was still God, but he emptied himself as his rights as God to appear in human form. There was a relinquishing there, a letting go of his divine privileges and his power. Letting go connects emptying and relinquishing, but it's far from abandonment. God did not abandon Jesus. Jesus did not abandon his position and personhood of God to become human. But he let go of that so that you and I might become part of the family. And so when we let go, we are able to grab hold of the Father's hand. When we are able to relinquish, when we are able to let go of sin, of brokenness, of pain, then we're able to grab hold of the Father's hand and become part of God's family. And this isn't, there's a great saying in the Emmaus community, let go and let God. It's supposed to be meaning about trusting God and stuff. It's not that. But it's about intentionally letting go of the things that hold us back and keep us from experiencing the full presence and love and grace of God so that we might be part of the family of God. It is about letting go so that we can claim our place at God's table because the invitation has already been issued. It's about letting go of our old life so that we can claim the new life. I think of Malachi in this video and now that there is a letting go, even subconsciously, of the old life to embrace the new life. Andrea and I heard an adoptive child who was in college speak one time, and she had a great family. She knew she had a great family, and she was also from China, which was extra special for us to hear. And she goes, sometimes I get really angry at my adoptive parents. She goes, I really don't know why. She's like, sometimes I long to know what life would have been back in China and all these things. But she said, I have to let go of that because I know that God has placed me with these parents for a reason. But sometimes we have to let go to be able to pick up and grab hold of everything that God has for us. And so for many of us, this is difficult because there are so many things that we hold on to so dearly that begin to identify who we are. We have to learn to let go of the jarring loss of divorce, the pain of death in our family, the possibility of a congregation splitting or a friend moving away. We have to let go of bitterness and unforgiveness, the ways in which we've hurt other people or we've allowed or been hurt by other people. We have to let go of our fractured humanity and our sin so that we can pick up and grab hold of God's hand and receive the gift of grace that God has offered us to come into God's family. When we learn to let go, we can grab hold of the Father's hand. This morning, as you consider what it means to be the family of God and this idea and this word of relinquish, letting go, what is it that you need to let go of today? What do you need to let go of in your life that may be toxic, that might be sinful, that might be broken? What is it that you need to let go of? What is it you need to relinquish to claim your position and your spot in God's family? And I want to invite you into a time of just reflection. There's going to be a video on the screen, and it is just a time to allow the Spirit to think and speak to you about areas that maybe you and I need to let go of so that we might encounter and be invited into God's story and God's family.